broken cowboy spirits. Temperance Tempe West was the first female banker in the state, and she was proud of her record, that is, until a slick con man by the name of Jack McGraw took an interest in her business. "I'm not here to rob you," Jack said, as he signed the paperwork. "Just here to help you make more money." Chapter 1. A ledger of her own. The scent of aged paper and ink, a familiar comfort, enveloped Temperance Tempe West as she meticulously balanced the bank's ledger. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving even this early in the morning, streamed through the window of the First Territorial Bank of Redemption, Arizona, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Tempe, at 57, felt every one of her years this morning, the lines etched around her sharp, blue eyes a testament to a life lived under the relentless desert sun and the even more relentless pressures of being the first female bank owner in the state. Her dark hair, streaked with silver that she refused to hide, was pulled back in a severe bun, emphasizing the strong line of her jaw and the determined set of her mouth. She wore a simple, yet impeccably tailored, brown dress, practical and unadorned, save for a small, silver brooch shaped like a saguaro cactus, a gift from her late husband, Thomas. He had always said she was as resilient and resourceful as the desert flora, capable of thriving even in the harshest conditions. Thomas had been gone for 15 years, taken by a sudden fever that swept through Redemption like a wildfire, leaving Tempe to manage the bank and their small ranch on the outskirts of town. She had grieved, of course, deeply and profoundly, but the frontier demanded resilience. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford for long. She'd poured her sorrow into the bank, transforming it from a fledgling enterprise into a cornerstone of the community, a testament to her grit and Thomas's unwavering belief in her. The bank was her sanctuary, a place of order and precision in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The heavy oak desk, the sturdy vault, the neatly stacked banknotes, they were all symbols of stability, of the control she exerted over at least one small corner of her life. Outside, Redemption bustled with the sounds of a growing frontier town. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of wagon wheels on the dusty main street, the raucous laughter spilling from the Golden Nugget Saloon across the way. Tempe preferred the quiet hum of numbers, the satisfying scratch of her pen on paper. She knew every depositor by name, their stories woven into the fabric of the bank's history. There was old Mrs. Abernathy, who kept her life savings tucked away in a biscuit tin, trusting Tempe more than any fancy lockbox. There was young Ethan Miller, saving every penny to buy a plot of land and build a future for his sweetheart, Sarah. And there was Sheriff Brody, a gruff but honest man, who kept the town's peace with a steady hand and an unwavering sense of justice. A shadow fell across her ledger, and Tempe looked up, her hand instinctively moving to the small derringer she kept tucked in a drawer beneath her desk. It was Jedediah, her loyal, if somewhat overly cautious, teller. He was a thin, wiry man with nervous eyes and a perpetually worried frown. "Morning, Miss West," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a gentleman here to see you." Tempe raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A gentleman? At this hour? Does he have a name?" "He does, ma'am. Says his name is McGraw." "Jack McGraw." Jedediah swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Well, he's not from around here." Tempe felt a flicker of unease, a prickle of intuition that she'd learned to trust over the years. Strangers in Redemption were either passing through or looking for something, and those looking for something often brought trouble with them. "Show him in, Jedediah," she said, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the apprehension she felt. She closed the ledger, placing a heavy paperweight on top, a silent gesture of closing off one world and preparing to enter another. She smoothed down her dress, a subconscious attempt to regain a sense of control. Jedediah hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting towards the door as if expecting a gunslinger to burst through at any moment. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and ushered in the stranger. Jack McGraw was not what Tempe expected. He wasn't a rough and tumble outlaw, nor was he a slick, oily salesman.
He was different.
Tall and lean, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, he had an air of quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. His eyes, a startling shade of green, held a glint of amusement, as if he found the world, and everyone in it, mildly entertaining. He wore a well-tailored suit, dusty from travel but undeniably expensive, and a Stetson hat that shaded his face, adding an element of mystery. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark, unruly hair, and offered Tempe a disarming smile. "Miss West, I presume? A pleasure to make your acquaintance." His voice was smooth, with a hint of a southern drawl that softened the edges of his words. Tempe remained seated, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. McGraw, what can I do for you?" She kept her tone neutral, professional, giving nothing away. He glanced around the bank, taking in the details with an appraising eye. "This is a fine establishment you have here, Miss West. A testament to your hard work and dedication, I'm sure." "It is," Tempe agreed, her voice tight. She didn't like flattery, especially from strangers. "I've heard whispers of your success, even as far away as Denver," McGraw continued, his smile widening. "They say you're the shrewdest banker in the territory, a woman who knows how to turn a profit." "Whispers travel far in the West, Mr. McGraw," Tempe said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not. What's your interest in my bank?" He leaned forward, placing his hands on the edge of her desk, his green eyes locking onto hers. "My interest, Miss West, is in helping you make even more money. I have a proposition for you, a partnership, if you will. One that could benefit us both greatly." Tempe felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was it. The reason for his visit. The trouble she'd sensed brewing. She'd dealt with men like McGraw before, men who promised riches and delivered ruin. Men who saw a woman alone and assumed she was easy prey. But she was not easy prey. She was Temperance West, and she would not be taken advantage of. "I'm not looking for a partner, Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'm doing just fine on my own." His smile didn't falter. "Perhaps. But everyone can use a little help, Miss West. Especially in a town like this, where fortunes can change as quickly as the desert wind." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I have certain skills, certain connections that could be very valuable to you." Tempe knew she should send him away, tell him she wasn't interested, but something held her back. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. Or maybe it was the ghost of Thomas, whispering in her ear, urging her to take a chance, to be bold. She had built this bank on calculated risks, on trusting her instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her to listen, to see what this man had to offer, even if it meant walking a dangerous path. She could see the desert stretching beyond the window, vast and unforgiving, and a similar landscape in the stranger's eyes. She had no idea the storm that she faced. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Proposition. The air in Tempe's office thickened, not with the oppressive heat of the day, but with the unspoken tension that hung between her and Jack McGraw. His proposition, veiled in charm and suggestion, felt like a lasso slowly tightening around her, testing her resolve. The quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a measure of Tempe's dwindling resistance. "Skills? Connections?" Tempe finally asked, her voice deliberately even. She leaned back in her chair, a subtle shift in posture that put a fraction more distance between them. "Be specific, Mr. McGraw. I don't deal in vagueness." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest that did little to ease her apprehension. "Fair enough, Miss West. I appreciate a woman who knows her own mind." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a folded document, placing it on the desk between them. "This, Miss West, is a land deed. A prime piece of property just north of town, bordering the river." Tempe picked up the document, her fingers tracing the elegant script. She recognized the name of the current owner, Old Man Hemmings, who had been trying to sell his ranch for years. The land was fertile, valuable, but Hemmings was stubborn and unwilling to negotiate a reasonable price. "Hemmings' land," Tempe said, her eyes still fixed on the document. He's asking a fortune for it. He was, McGraw corrected, his green eyes glinting. Until I persuaded him otherwise. Tempe looked up, her gaze sharp and questioning. Persuaded him?
How?
McGraw shrugged, a casual gesture that belied the underlying implication. Let's just say I have a way with words, Miss West. And I'm not afraid to use them. He paused, letting the weight of his unspoken threat settle in the air. I acquired the land for a fraction of its market value, and I'm willing to offer it to you, as part of our partnership. Tempe felt a chill run down her spine. There was a darkness in this man, a ruthlessness that he barely bothered to conceal. She knew that persuasion in the West often involved more than just words. It involved pressure, intimidation, sometimes even violence. And what would this partnership entail, Mr. McGraw? Tempe asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. She needed to know the full extent of his offer, the price of his generosity. He leaned forward again, his gaze intense. Simple, Miss West. I provide the land, you provide the capital. We develop it together, build a town, a thriving community. We'll control the water rights, the trade routes, everything. We'll be the wealthiest people in the territory. Tempe's mind raced. The possibilities were undeniable. Hemming's land was a strategic gold mine, a key to controlling the future growth of the region. But the cost. The cost was potentially devastating. Partnering with McGraw meant aligning herself with a man who operated outside the law, a man who was clearly capable of anything. She thought of Thomas, of his unwavering belief in honesty and integrity. He had built their life on a foundation of hard work and fair dealing. Could she betray that legacy, even for the promise of immense wealth? Could she compromise her principles, her very soul, for the sake of ambition? The internal struggle raged within her, a battle between the pragmatism that had kept her alive in this harsh land and the moral compass that had guided her through life. She looked at McGraw, at his confident smile and his knowing eyes, and she saw a reflection of the darkness that lurked within herself, the temptation to seize power, to control her destiny, no matter the cost. I need time to consider your offer, Mr. McGraw, Tempe said, her voice surprisingly steady. She needed to distance herself from him, to think clearly, to weigh the risks and rewards. Of course, Miss West, McGraw replied, his smile unwavering. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often. And in the West, time is a precious commodity. He stood up, extending his hand. I'll be staying at the Grand Hotel. Let me know when you've made your decision. Tempe hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. His grip was firm, strong, and she felt a jolt of something that was both unsettling and intriguing. There was a raw power in this man, a magnetic force that drew her in even as it repelled her. She watched him walk out of her office, his silhouette framed against the bright sunlight, and she felt a sense of both relief and dread. He had left the land deed on her desk, a tangible reminder of his offer, of the choice she had to make. Jedediah appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. Miss West, are you all right? That man. He seemed like trouble, Jedediah. Tempe finished for him, her voice weary. And he is. But he also might be the key to something significant. She picked up the land deed again, her fingers tracing the boundaries of Hemming's ranch, of the future that McGraw had laid out before her. She thought of the small, struggling town of Redemption, of the people who depended on her on the bank. Could she turn away from an opportunity that could transform their lives, even if it meant walking a dangerous path? Even if it meant risking everything she held dear? She stared out the window, at nothing, wondering if she was strong enough to handle the consequences. She had no idea the road ahead would be paved with secrets. Chapter 3. Signatures and Suspicions. The days following Jack McGraw's visit were a blur of restless nights and anxious days for Tempe. The land deed sat on her desk, a constant, silent presence, a physical manifestation of the weighty decision she faced. She found herself staring at it for hours, lost in a labyrinth of calculations and what-ifs. The potential for profit was immense, almost dizzying, but the unease that gnawed at her gut refused to be silenced. She tried to focus on the routine of the bank, the familiar rhythm of deposits and withdrawals, the reassuring presence of her regular customers. But even the comforting scent of old money and the clink of coins couldn't fully distract her from the shadow of Jack McGraw and his proposition. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody stopped by, his weathered face etched with concern. He removed his hat, revealing a thinning patch of gray hair, and leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on Tempe. "Heard there's a new fellow in town," he said, his voice gruff but laced with a hint of curiosity. "Name of McGraw. Staying at the Grand." Tempe nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "He came to see me. About a business proposition." Brody raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Business, huh? What kind of business?" Tempe hesitated. She trusted Brody, had relied on his steady presence and unwavering sense of justice for years. But she also knew that revealing the details of McGraw's offer could put the sheriff in a difficult position. McGraw was clearly a man who operated on the fringes of the law, and Brody was a man who upheld it. "He's offering to sell me Hemming's land," Tempe said, choosing her words carefully. "He says he acquired it recently." Brody's expression darkened. "Hemming's, eh? That old coot wouldn't sell his land to the devil himself." "Something ain't right about this, Tempe." "Be careful." Tempe forced a smile. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I can handle myself." Brody didn't look convinced. "I know you can, Tempe. You're the strongest woman I know. But this McGraw fella, I've heard whispers. He's got a reputation. A bad one." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Just promise me you'll be cautious. Don't rush into anything." "I promise," Tempe said, though she knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. The lure of the opportunity, the potential to transform redemption, was a powerful force, one that was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. Later that evening, Tempe found herself walking towards the Grand Hotel. She hadn't made a conscious decision to go, but her feet seemed to be moving of their own accord, drawn by an invisible thread that connected her to Jack McGraw. The hotel was the finest establishment in town, a two-story building with ornate balconies and a brightly lit lobby. The sounds of music and laughter spilled out onto the street, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of Tempe's office. She found McGraw in the hotel's saloon, seated at a table in a dimly lit corner, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was alone, seemingly lost in thought, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Miss West," he said, rising to his feet. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." "I don't forget easily, Mr. McGraw," Tempe replied, her voice cool and composed. She took a seat opposite him, placing her small reticule on the table. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her skin prickle. "I'm glad to hear it. Have you come to a decision?" Tempe took a deep breath. "I have. I'll agree to your partnership, Mr. McGraw. On one condition." His smile widened. "And what's that?" "I want to see the paperwork. All of it. The original deed from Hemming's, any contracts you signed, everything. I need to know exactly how you acquired that land." McGraw's expression didn't change, but Tempe saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief hesitation before he regained his composure. "Of course, Miss West. I understand your caution. I'll have the documents delivered to your office tomorrow morning. And one more thing," Tempe added, her gaze unwavering. "I want a clause in our agreement stating that all our dealings will be conducted according to the law. No exceptions." McGraw chuckled. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss West. But I admire your spirit. Very well. We'll play by your rules. For now." The last two words hung in the air, a subtle threat, a reminder that he was not a man to be trifled with. Tempe met his gaze, refusing to back down. She had made her decision, crossed the Rubicon, and now she had to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. She had signed her name on the dotted line, both literally and figuratively, and she knew, with a growing sense of dread, that she had just made a deal with a man who could either make her dreams come true or destroy everything she had worked for. She only hoped that when the dust began to settle, she would find that she had made the right choice. She had only agreed because she was sure she could outwit him. Chapter 4. The Weight of Gold and Promises. The next morning, a stack of documents arrived at Tempe's office, delivered not by Jack McGraw himself, but by a young, nervous-looking man who introduced himself as McGraw's associate. The man deposited the papers on Tempe's desk with a hurried bow and quickly retreated, leaving Tempe alone with the tangible evidence of her gamble. The documents were extensive, a mix of legal jargon and handwritten notes, detailing the transfer of Hemming's land to McGraw. Tempe meticulously reviewed each page, her sharp eyes scanning for any inconsistencies, any hidden clauses that might betray McGraw's true intentions. Jedediah hovered nearby, his anxiety palpable, occasionally offering a hesitant question or observation. The original deed from Hemming's was there, signed and witnessed, but the signature looked shaky, almost forced. The accompanying contract, outlining the terms of the sale, was surprisingly brief and vague, lacking the usual detailed stipulations that Tempe would expect in such a transaction. There were also several promissory notes, indicating that McGraw had paid Hemmings a significant sum of money, but the source of those funds was unclear. Tempe's suspicion grew with each page she turned. Something was definitely amiss. The paperwork was too clean, too convenient. It was as if McGraw had anticipated her scrutiny and crafted the documents to conceal his true methods. She was missing a key to unlock the mystery of the deal that had been conducted. She spent the rest of the day poring over the documents, cross-referencing them with her own records, trying to find a crack in the facade. She even sent Jedediah to the county courthouse to check for any filed liens or claims against Hemming's land, but he returned empty-handed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her office, Tempe leaned back in her chair, her head throbbing, her eyes tired. She had found nothing concrete, no definitive proof of wrongdoing, but her intuition screamed that something was wrong. She felt like she was holding a puzzle with missing pieces, a picture that refused to come into focus. A knock on the door startled her. It was McGraw, his face bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. He held a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "I thought we might celebrate our partnership, Miss West," he said, his smile disarming. "A toast to our future success." Tempe hesitated, her hand instinctively reaching for the derringer in her drawer. But she forced herself to relax. She couldn't afford to show him her suspicion, not yet. She needed to play along, to gain his trust, until she could uncover the truth. "Of course, Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A toast. He poured the champagne, the bubbles fizzing and popping in the quiet room. He raised his glass. "To redemption," he said, his green eyes locking onto hers. "May it become the jewel of the territory." Tempe raised her glass, her gaze unwavering. "To redemption," she echoed, her voice laced with a hint of irony. She took a sip of the champagne, the cool liquid sliding down her throat, but it did little to ease the knot of apprehension in her stomach. They talked for a while, McGraw outlining his grand vision for the development of Hemming's land. He spoke of building a new town, attracting settlers, constructing a railroad spur, even establishing a new bank, a rival to Tempe's own. His words were seductive, painting a picture of prosperity and progress, but Tempe listened with a growing sense of unease. She realized that his ambition extended far beyond a simple partnership. He wanted to control everything, to dominate the region, and she was just a pawn in his game. As the evening wore on and the champagne bottle emptied, Tempe felt a growing sense of vulnerability. She was alone with this man, this charming, dangerous man, and she knew that she was playing a risky game. She had to be careful, to watch every word, every gesture, to avoid revealing her true feelings. "You seem troubled, Miss West," McGraw said, his voice softening, his gaze searching hers. "Is there something on your mind?" Tempe forced a smile. "Just tired, Mr. McGraw. It's been a long day." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You work too hard, Miss West. You need to relax, to enjoy life. Let me take care of you." His words were both a promise and a threat, a subtle reminder of the power he held over her. Tempe gently pulled her hand away, her heart pounding in her chest. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. McGraw. but I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. She stood. She had made certain that she could outmaneuver him. He rose as well, his eyes lingering on hers. As you wish, Miss West. But remember, I'm here for you. Always. He walked her to the door, his hand lightly brushing against her back, a gesture that was both intimate and possessive. Tempe felt a wave of relief as she stepped out into the cool night air, away from his intense gaze, away from the suffocating weight of his promises. She knew that she had just entered a dangerous dance, a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The gold was heavy and the promises were gilded, but she had a growing feeling that the true cost would be measured in something far more precious. The stars were out, and she felt small and insignificant. Chapter 5. Echoes of Whispered Warnings. The following days saw a flurry of activity as Tempe and McGraw began to lay the groundwork for their partnership. Surveyors arrived to map out Hemming's land, and laborers began clearing the brush, their axes ringing through the quiet desert air. Tempe found herself increasingly drawn into McGraw's orbit, attending meetings with potential investors, reviewing construction plans, and even accompanying him on trips to neighboring towns to drum up support for their project. McGraw was a master of charm and persuasion, effortlessly winning over everyone he met. He had a knack for making people feel important, for listening to their concerns, and for promising them a piece of the prosperity he envisioned. Tempe watched him work, both fascinated and repelled by his manipulative skills. She saw how easily he could sway opinions, how effortlessly he could bend people to his will. She also noticed the subtle ways he began to exert control over her, subtly undermining her authority, making decisions without consulting her, and even questioning her judgment in front of others. He would frame it as helpful advice or constructive criticism, but Tempe recognized it for what it was, a calculated attempt to diminish her standing and establish himself as the dominant partner. One afternoon, while they were inspecting the progress of the construction, McGraw casually mentioned that he had hired a new foreman, a man named Rattlesnake Rick, a notorious gunslinger with a reputation for violence. Tempe was immediately alarmed. "Rattlesnake Rick?" she exclaimed, her voice sharp. "You hired him without consulting me? He's a known outlaw." McGraw shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "He's the best man for the job, Tempe. He knows how to keep order, how to deal with troublemakers. We need someone like him to protect our investment." "Protect our investment?" Tempe retorted. "Or enforce your will. I don't want that kind of man associated with this project." McGraw's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard look. "Don't be naive, Tempe. This is the West. We're not running a Sunday school here. We need to be prepared to defend ourselves, to fight for what's ours." Tempe met his gaze, refusing to back down. "There's a difference between defending ourselves and employing a murder. I won't have it." McGraw studied her for a moment, his green eyes assessing her resolve. Then, to her surprise, he backed down. "All right, Tempe. You have a point. I'll talk to Rick. I'll make sure he understands the rules." Tempe knew it was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it gave her a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she could still control McGraw, perhaps she could still steer their partnership in a direction that aligned with her values. Later that evening, Tempe received a visit from Sheriff Brody. He looked even more worried than usual, his face etched with lines of concern. "Tempe, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've been doing some digging on this McGraw fella. And what I found, it ain't pretty." Tempe's heart sank. She knew this was coming, had been dreading it, but hearing it from Brody made it all the more real. "What did you find?" Brody leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "He's got a history, Tempe. A long one. Bank robberies, land grabs, even murder. He's a dangerous man, a snake in the grass." Tempe felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected as much, but hearing the details, the concrete evidence of McGraw's past, confirmed her worst fears. "What about Hemmings?" Tempe asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you find anything about how McGraw acquired his land?" Brody nodded grimly. "I spoke to Hemming's neighbor, Old Man Johnson. He said he saw McGraw and a couple of his men riding out to Hemming's ranch a few weeks ago. He heard shouting, then gunshots. He didn't see what happened, but he's sure something bad went down. Tempe felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been so blinded by the potential for profit, by the allure of McGraw's vision, that she had ignored her instincts, her own better judgment. She had partnered with a murderer, a man who had likely killed Hemmings to get his land. "I have to get out of this, Brody," Tempe said, her voice desperate. "I have to break the partnership." Brody shook his head sadly. "It ain't that simple, Tempe. You signed a contract. He's got you legally bound. And he's not the kind of man to let go easily." Tempe felt trapped, cornered. She had walked into a trap of her own making, and now she was paying the price. She looked at Brody, her eyes filled with despair. "What am I going to do?" Brody placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure something out, Tempe. We always do. But you need to be careful. Watch your back. McGraw is not to be trusted."
He paused.
"I will protect you with my life." His words, meant to reassure her, only deepened her fear. She knew that Brody was a good man, a brave man, but he was no match for McGraw and his ruthless gang. She had put them both in danger, and she didn't know how to get them out. The whispers of warning had become a roar in her ears, and she realized, with a growing sense of dread, that she was in far deeper than she had ever imagined. The moon hung like a scythe in the sky. Chapter 6. The Dance of Deception. The weight of Brody's revelation pressed down on Tempe, crushing her spirit and filling her with a gnawing sense of guilt. She had allowed herself to be seduced by McGraw's charm and promises, and now she was complicit in his crimes, trapped in a partnership that felt more like a prison. Sleep offered no escape, her nights haunted by nightmares of violence and betrayal, of Hemming's terrified face and McGraw's cold, calculating eyes. She knew she had to find a way out, to break the contract and expose McGraw for the criminal he was, but she was also acutely aware of the danger she faced. McGraw was not a man to be crossed, and he had already demonstrated his ruthlessness. She needed a plan, a strategy that would allow her to outwit him without putting herself and those she cared about in harm's way. She began to distance herself from McGraw, subtly at first, avoiding unnecessary meetings, delaying decisions, and finding excuses to stay away from the construction site. She used the time to gather information, discreetly questioning the townspeople, reviewing the bank's records, and searching for any evidence that might help her build a case against him. She discovered that McGraw had been quietly buying up other properties in the area, using similar tactics of intimidation and coercion. He was consolidating his power, building an empire on a foundation of fear and violence. Tempe realized that he wasn't just interested in redemption, he wanted to control the entire territory, to become a law unto himself. One evening, Tempe decided to confront McGraw directly. She found him in the saloon, as usual, surrounded by his cronies, including the menacing rattlesnake Rick. She approached him, her head held high, her expression determined. "We need to talk, Jack," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. McGraw raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Of course, Tempe. What's on your mind?" She glanced around the saloon, at the curious faces watching them. "In private," she said, her voice low. McGraw nodded and led her to a small, empty room at the back of the saloon. He closed the door, shutting out the noise and the prying eyes. "So, what's this all about, Tempe?" he asked, his voice softening, his gaze searching hers. Tempe took a deep breath. "I know about Hemmings," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you murdered him to get his land." McGraw's expression didn't change, but Tempe saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief flash of anger before he regained his composure. "You have no proof of that, Tempe," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I have enough," Tempe retorted. "I have witnesses, I have evidence. I'm going to the authorities." McGraw chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "The authorities? You mean Sheriff Brody? He's a good man, but he's out of his depth. He can't touch me." "We'll see about that," Tempe said, her voice defiant. "I'm not afraid of you, Jack." McGraw stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You should be, Tempe. You've made a powerful enemy." And I don't forgive easily. Tempe met his gaze, refusing to back down. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm demanding justice. He laughed again, a harsh, mocking sound. Justice? In the West? There's only one kind of justice, Tempe. The kind that comes from the barrel of a gun. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. You're playing a dangerous game, Tempe. A game you can't win. Tempe struggled to free herself, but his grip was too strong. She felt a surge of fear, a cold realization of the vulnerability of her position. She was alone with this man, this ruthless killer, and he could do anything he wanted to her. Let me go, Jack, she said, her voice trembling. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. I could break you, Tempe. I could ruin you, but I won't. Not yet. Because I still believe you can be useful to me. He released her arm, his touch lingering for a moment, a silent threat. Think carefully about your next move, Tempe. Your future, your life, depends on it. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Tempe alone, shaken and terrified. She had confronted him, challenged him, and now she had to face the consequences. She had entered a dance of deception, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, and she knew that she was running out of time. She had to find a way to expose him, to stop him, before he destroyed everything she held dear. She walked slowly back to her small house, the floorboards seeming to creak with every worry she had piled up. Chapter 7. Under a Sky of Shifting Sands. The days that followed Tempe's confrontation with McGraw were a tense and uneasy waiting game. She felt his eyes on her constantly, a silent, ever-present threat that made it difficult to breathe, to think, to plan. She knew he was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to give him an excuse to strike. She continued to gather information, piecing together the fragments of his crimes, searching for the definitive proof that would bring him down. She spent hours in the county courthouse, poring over land records, legal documents, and old newspapers, looking for any connection, any clue that might link McGraw to Hemming's murder. She discovered that McGraw had a long history of fraudulent land deals, using a network of shell corporations and frontmen to conceal his ownership. He had left a trail of ruined lives and broken dreams across the territory, leaving behind a legacy of fear and resentment. One evening, while she was working late at the bank, Jedediah approached her, his face pale and drawn. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hand. Miss West, I found this. Hidden in one of the old ledgers, he stammered. I think it's important. Tempe took the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a handwritten note, dated several months before Hemming's death. The writing was shaky, almost illegible, but Tempe recognized it as Hemming's scrawl. The note read, McGraw came today. Threatened me. Said he'd take my land one way or another. Afraid for my life. Told him I'd never sell. He laughed. Said I wouldn't have a choice. Tempe felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of excitement and dread. This was it. The proof she had been searching for. A direct link between McGraw and Hemming's murder. A confession, of sorts, written by the victim himself. She knew she had to get this note to Sheriff Brody, but she also knew that McGraw would be watching her every move. She couldn't simply walk into the sheriff's office. She needed a plan, a way to deliver the evidence without alerting McGraw. She decided to use the upcoming town social as a cover. The social, a monthly gathering of the townspeople, was held in the town square, a large, open space where everyone mingled and danced. It was the perfect opportunity to discreetly slip the note to Brody without arousing suspicion. The night of the social arrived, and Tempe dressed in a simple, yet elegant, blue dress, her silver cactus brooch her only adornment. She tucked the note into her reticule, her hand trembling slightly. The town square was bustling with activity, the air filled with music, laughter, and the aroma of roasted meat. Tempe mingled with the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, trying to appear calm and relaxed, but her heart was racing. She spotted McGraw across the square, surrounded by his usual entourage. He was watching her, his green eyes narrowed, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. She knew he was suspicious, that he was waiting for her to make a move. She saw Brody standing near the bandstand, talking to a group of ranchers. She slowly made her way towards him, her eyes darting around, making sure she wasn't being followed. As she approached Brody, she stumbled, pretending to lose her balance. She reached out to him for support, discreetly slipping the note into his hand. "Sheriff," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Read this. It's important." Brody caught the note, his eyes widening in surprise. He glanced at Tempe, then at the note, understanding dawning in his expression. He nodded subtly, acknowledging her message. Tempe straightened up, forcing a smile.
"Thank you, Sheriff."
"I'm feeling a bit dizzy." She moved away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had delivered the evidence, put the wheels in motion. Now it was up to Brody to act. She had to have faith. She kept dancing, acting as if she was enjoying herself. She didn't realize how the shifting sands of fate were moving. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Foundation. The days following the town social were filled with a suffocating tension. Tempe waited, her nerves stretched taut, for Brody to make his move. She knew he needed time to verify the note, to gather his deputies, to prepare for a confrontation with McGraw, but the waiting was almost unbearable. She continued to go through the motions of her daily life, running the bank, overseeing the construction project from a distance, and avoiding McGraw as much as possible. But her mind was constantly racing, replaying every conversation, every encounter, searching for any clue, any indication of what McGraw might be planning. She noticed subtle changes in the town's atmosphere. People seemed more cautious, more reserved, their conversations hushed, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Whispers followed her wherever she went, whispers of McGraw's growing power, of his ruthless methods, of the danger that loomed over redemption. One morning, Jedediah came to her office, his face ashen. "Miss West," he stammered, his voice trembling. There's trouble at the construction site. Rattlesnake Rick. He shot a man." Tempe's blood ran cold. She had feared this, had warned McGraw about Rick's violent tendencies, but he had ignored her. Now, a man was dead, and the fragile piece of redemption was shattered.
"Who is it?"
Tempe asked, her voice barely a whisper. "One of the laborers," Jedediah replied.
He
questioned Rick's orders. They argued.
"Rick."
He just pulled out his gun and shot him. Tempe felt a wave of anger and despair wash over her. This was McGraw's doing, his responsibility. He had created this climate of violence, this reign of terror, and now innocent people were paying the price. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act, to confront McGraw, to stop him before he caused any more harm. She grabbed her derringer, tucking it into her pocket, and headed towards the construction site. The scene that greeted her was chaotic. The laborers were gathered in a frightened huddle, their faces pale and drawn. Rattlesnake Rick stood over the body of the dead man, his gun still smoking, his expression defiant. McGraw was there, too, his face a mask of cold indifference. "What happened here, Jack?" Tempe demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. McGraw shrugged. "An accident, Tempe." The man was insubordinate. Rick was just doing his job. "His job?" Tempe retorted, her voice trembling with rage. "His job is to oversee construction, not to murder innocent men." McGraw's eyes narrowed. "You're overreacting, Tempe. This is the West. Things like this happen. Not in my town," Tempe said, her voice firm. "Not on my land. I won't tolerate it." She turned to Rick, her gaze unwavering. "You're fired, Rick. Get off this property. And if I ever see you again, I'll have Sheriff Brody arrest you." Rick sneered, his hand hovering over his gun. "You ain't got the guts, old woman." Tempe didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked onto his. "Try me," she said, her voice low and steady. For a moment, the two stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. Then, to Tempe's surprise, Rick backed down. He holstered his gun, turned, and stalked away, his boots kicking up dust. Tempe turned back to McGraw, her expression furious. "This ends now, Jack. Our partnership is over. I'm going to the authorities, and I'm going to expose you for the criminal you are." McGraw smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "You think you can stop me, Tempe? You're a fool. I own this town. I own you." He took a step towards her, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Tempe knew what was coming. She reached for her derringer, her fingers closing around the cold metal. But before either of them could act, a shout rang out. "Hold it right there, McGraw." It was Sheriff Brody, his gun drawn, his face grim. He was flanked by several deputies, their rifles aimed at McGraw and his men. "It's over, McGraw," Brody said, his voice steady. "You're under arrest." The cracks in McGraw's foundation were beginning to show. The carefully constructed facade of respectability and partnership was crumbling, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath. Tempe had planted the seeds of doubt, and now, the harvest of his misdeeds was at hand. The foundation that was built was showing its weakness. Chapter 9. The Price of Trust. The sudden appearance of Sheriff Brody and his deputies created a tableau of frozen tension. McGraw, his hand still inside his jacket, slowly turned his head, his green eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. His men, caught off guard, hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons. The laborers, sensing a shift in the balance of power, began to edge away, seeking safety in the shadows. Well, Sheriff, McGraw said, his voice smooth, but laced with a hint of steel. "What seems to be the problem?" "You're under arrest, McGraw," Brody repeated, his voice unwavering. "For the murder of Henry Hemmings and for numerous other crimes." McGraw laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed across the construction site. "You have no proof, Brody. Just the ramblings of a hysterical old woman." He gestured towards Tempe, his eyes filled with contempt. "I have a witness," Brody said, his gaze steady. "And I have a note, written by Hemmings himself, accusing you of threatening him." McGraw's expression flickered for a moment, a brief flash of surprise before he regained his composure. "A forgery," he scoffed. "Anyone could have written that." "We'll let a judge decide that," Brody said. He nodded to his deputies.
"Take him."
The deputies moved forward, their rifles trained on McGraw and his men. For a moment, it looked as if a gunfight was inevitable. McGraw's men tensed, their hands tightening around their weapons. "Don't be fools," McGraw said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't want to die for this." His men hesitated, their eyes darting between McGraw and the deputies. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they knew it. "It's over, Jack," Tempe said, her voice surprisingly calm. "Give it up." McGraw turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked almost like regret. "You betrayed me, Tempe," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You trusted me, and I trusted you." He was projecting again. "You murdered an innocent man, Jack," Tempe retorted. "You lied, you cheated, you manipulated everyone around you. You don't know the meaning of trust." McGraw stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he slowly removed his hand from his jacket. Empty. "All right, Brody," he said, his voice resigned. "You win. Take me in." The deputies moved forward, disarming McGraw and his men. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief, of justice served. As McGraw was being led away, he turned to Tempe one last time. "This isn't over, Tempe," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I'll be back. And you'll pay for this." Tempe met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice firm. She watched as he was taken away, his silhouette disappearing into the distance. She felt a mixture of emotions, relief, satisfaction, but also a lingering sense of unease. She knew that McGraw was a dangerous man, a man who held grudges, and she knew that he would not give up easily. Brody approached her, his face etched with concern. "You all right, Tempe?" he asked. "I am now," Tempe replied, her voice weary. "Thank you, Brody, for everything." Brody smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "We did it together, Tempe. You were the brave one." You risked everything to bring him to justice. Tempe shook her head. I was a fool, Brody. I almost destroyed everything.
But you didn't, Brody said.
You learned from your mistake. You redeemed yourself. That's what matters. He was right. She had made a terrible mistake, trusting McGraw, but she had also found the strength to correct it, to fight for what was right. She had paid a heavy price, the price of her naivete, her trust, but she had also gained something valuable, a deeper understanding of herself, of the world, of the true meaning of courage. As she stared into the setting sun, she knew that she had to be more careful. Chapter 10. Letters from a Ghost Town. The arrest of Jack McGraw sent ripples of shock and relief through redemption. The townspeople, who had lived under the shadow of his growing power, rejoiced at his downfall, celebrating the return of law and order. Tempe, hailed as a heroine, found herself the object of admiration and gratitude, but she couldn't fully embrace the praise. The weight of her near disaster, the knowledge of her complicity in McGraw's crimes, still haunted her. She threw herself into her work, focusing on rebuilding the trust she had almost shattered. She worked tirelessly to repair the damage McGraw had done, offering fair loans to those he had exploited, and supporting the community in every way she could. She wanted to restore redemption. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old bank records, Tempe stumbled upon a packet of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Thomas, her late husband, and were postmarked from a small, remote town called Silver Creek, a place Tempe had never heard of. Curiosity piqued. She carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a delicate, feminine script, and the letter was dated several years before Thomas's death. As Tempe read the letter, her heart began to pound. The letter was from a woman named Sarah, and it was clear from the tone that she and Thomas had been more than just friends. Sarah wrote of their shared dreams, their secret meetings, their passionate love for each other. Tempe felt a wave of emotions wash over her, shock, betrayal, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. She had loved Thomas, had trusted him completely, and now, she discovered that he had hidden a secret life from her, a life filled with passion and deceit. She read through the rest of the letters, each one a further blow to her heart. Sarah wrote of her pregnancy, of her hope that Thomas would leave Tempe and marry her, of her despair when he refused. The last letter, written shortly before Thomas's death, was filled with bitterness and resentment, accusing him of abandoning her and their child. Tempe sat in stunned silence, the letters scattered around her, her world shattered once again. She had thought she knew Thomas, had built her life on the foundation of their love, but now she realized that she had been living a lie. The man she had idolized, the man she had mourned, had been a stranger to her. She felt a surge of anger towards Thomas, towards Sarah, towards herself for being so blind, so naive. But beneath the anger, there was a deep well of sadness, a profound sense of loss. She had lost not only her husband, but also the illusion of their perfect marriage, the foundation of her happiness. She didn't know what to do with this newfound knowledge. Should she try to find Sarah, to learn more about this secret life of Thomas's? Should she confront the past or try to bury it, to protect the memory of the man she had loved? She decided to confide in Sheriff Brody, seeking his counsel, his support. She showed him the letters, her hands trembling as she recounted their contents. Brody listened patiently, his face etched with concern. "I'm sorry, Tempe," he said softly. "This must be devastating." "I don't know what to do," Tempe said, her voice choked with emotion. "I feel like my whole life has been a lie." Brody placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault, Tempe. You couldn't have known. Thomas. He was a good man, but he made mistakes. We all do. But this." Tempe gestured towards the letters. "This is different. This is a betrayal of everything we had." "I understand," Brody said. "But you can't let this destroy you, Tempe. You're stronger than that. You've overcome so much. You can overcome this too." He was right. She had faced adversity before, had survived loss and hardship. She couldn't let this new revelation break her. She had to find a way to come to terms with the past, to make peace with Thomas's memory, to move forward with her life. She had to find some meaning. She had to find peace. Chapter 11. The Heart's Reckoning. The discovery of Thomas's secret life sent Tempe on a journey of introspection, forcing her to confront not only her husband's betrayal, but also her own long-held beliefs about love, trust, and forgiveness. She spent hours walking the dusty streets of redemption, lost in thought, replaying memories of her life with Thomas, searching for clues, for any indication of the hidden truth she had missed. She realized that she had idealized Thomas, had placed him on a pedestal, seeing him as a perfect, flawless man. She had clung to that image, especially after his death, finding solace in the memory of their seemingly perfect love. But now, confronted with the reality of his infidelity, she had to reevaluate her entire relationship, to see him as a complex, flawed human being, capable of both great love and great betrayal. She began to question her own role in their marriage, wondering if she had been too focused on the bank, on her own ambitions, neglecting Thomas's needs and desires. Had she driven him into the arms of another woman? Had she been so blinded by her own ideals that she had failed to see the cracks in their relationship? The guilt and self-doubt gnawed at her, threatening to consume her. She found it difficult to concentrate on her work, to interact with people, to find joy in anything. She felt isolated, alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. One evening, she found herself standing on the porch of her small ranch house, gazing out at the vast, starlit sky. She remembered the nights she and Thomas had spent together, sitting on this same porch, sharing dreams, making plans. She had felt so safe, so secure in his love, but now, that sense of security was shattered, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. She realized that she had been living in the past, clinging to memories, refusing to move forward. She had allowed her grief, her sense of betrayal, to define her, to limit her. She had become a prisoner of her own emotions, trapped in a cycle of regret and self-pity. She decided that she needed to break free, to confront the past, to find a way to heal. She decided to journey to Silver Creek, the town where Sarah, Thomas's mistress, had lived. She needed to see the place, to meet the woman, to understand the other side of Thomas's life. She packed a small bag, saddled her horse, and set off on the long, arduous journey. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. She rode for days, sleeping under the stars, eating meager meals, pushing herself to her physical and emotional limits. As she rode, she began to reflect on her own life, on her own choices. She realized that she had been so focused on building a successful career, on proving herself in a man's world, that she had neglected her own emotional needs. She had been so afraid of vulnerability, of showing weakness, that she had built walls around her heart, shutting out love, shutting out life. She had much to learn. The journey was a crucible, a test of her resilience, her determination. She faced storms, heat, and exhaustion, but she pressed on, driven by a need to find answers, to find closure. She finally reached Silver Creek, a small, dusty ghost town, a shadow of its former self. The buildings were dilapidated, the streets deserted, the air filled with a sense of melancholy and decay. It was a place of forgotten dreams, of shattered hopes, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation that awaited her. She knew she needed to reconcile the past. The sun beat down. Chapter 12. Shadows of the Past. Silver Creek was a town clinging precariously to life, a scattering of weathered buildings huddled together as if for protection against the relentless desert winds. It was a far cry from the bustling, growing community of Redemption, and Tempe felt a pang of sympathy for the woman who had lived and loved here, waiting for a man who would never fully be hers. Tempe found the small, run-down house that Sarah had described in her letters. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the garden was overgrown with weeds, but there was a certain faded charm to the place, a whisper of the life that had once flourished within its walls. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, then knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She tried the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open. The house was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of neglect. The furniture was sparse and worn, covered in sheets, as if waiting for occupants who would never return. Tempe walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes scanning the details, trying to imagine Sarah's life here, her hopes, her dreams, her heartbreak. She found a small, framed photograph on a dusty mantelpiece. It was a picture of Thomas, younger, his eyes filled with a light that Tempe hadn't seen in years. Beside him stood a woman, her face blurred and indistinct, but Tempe recognized the delicate features, the same handwriting from the letters. And in the woman's arms, a baby, a small, fragile life that had been caught in the crossfire of a forbidden love. Tempe felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of anger, sadness, and a surprising pang of empathy for Sarah. She saw in the photograph a woman who had loved deeply, who had risked everything for that love, and who had ultimately been left alone, heartbroken, to raise a child on her own. As Tempe was examining the photograph, she heard a noise behind her. She turned and saw an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her face weathered and lined, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity.
Who are you?
The woman asked, her voice raspy. What are you doing here? Tempe took a deep breath. My name is Temperance West, she said. I was married to Thomas West. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. She studied Tempe for a moment, her gaze searching, assessing. You're Tempe? She said, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas's wife. Tempe nodded. I found some letters. From a woman named Sarah. I believe she lived here. The woman's expression softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes.
Sarah was my daughter, she said.
She passed away a few years ago. Tempe felt a pang of regret. She had come all this way to confront Sarah, to demand answers, but now, she realized that it was too late. Sarah was gone, and Tempe would never have the chance to hear her side of the story. I'm sorry, Tempe said, her voice filled with genuine sorrow. I didn't know. The woman invited Tempe to sit down, and they talked for hours. The woman, whose name was Martha, told Tempe about Sarah's life, about her love for Thomas, about the pain of his betrayal, about the struggle to raise their child alone. Martha didn't excuse Thomas's actions, but she also didn't condemn him. She spoke of him with a mixture of fondness and regret, acknowledging his flaws, but also remembering his kindness, his charm, his genuine affection for Sarah. Tempe listened patiently, her heart aching for both Sarah and Thomas, for the tangled web of love and betrayal that had connected them. She realized that there were no easy answers, no simple explanations. Their story was a complex tapestry of human emotions, of flawed choices, of the enduring power of love and loss. She had to learn how to reconcile it all. Martha spoke of the son that was produced by the affair. She had to see him. Chapter 13. Where the River Bends. Martha revealed that Thomas and Sarah's son, named Samuel, was still living, working as a ranch hand on a spread a few miles outside of Silver Creek, near a bend in the river that fed the dwindling town. The information was a jolt to Tempe, a sudden, unexpected turn in a journey she thought was nearing its end. She had come seeking closure, seeking to understand the shadows of her husband's past, and now she was faced with the living embodiment of that past, a tangible link to a secret life she had only just discovered. He doesn't know who his father was? Tempe asked, her voice hesitant. Martha shook her head. Sarah never told him. She was afraid, I think, afraid of what Thomas might do, afraid of what the townspeople might say. She raised him on her own, with my help, and she told him his father had died before he was born. Tempe felt a surge of conflicting emotions, curiosity, apprehension, and a strange sense of responsibility. This man, Samuel, was Thomas's son, a part of her late husband's life that she had never known. Did she have a right to intrude on his life, to reveal a truth that might shatter his world? Would he want to see me? Tempe asked, her voice barely a whisper. Martha shrugged.
I don't know, she said.
He's a good man, Samuel. Strong, hardworking, honest. But he's also proud, and he carries a lot of hurt inside. He's had a hard life. Tempe decided that she had to see him, to meet this man who shared her husband's blood, to offer him something. She wasn't sure what. Closure? An explanation? An apology? Martha gave Tempe directions to the ranch, a sprawling property nestled in a valley where the river widened and the land was surprisingly fertile. Tempe rode for several hours, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As she approached the ranch, she saw a man working in the corral, training a young horse. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and weathered features, and there was a certain resemblance to Thomas, a familiar set to the jaw, a familiar glint in the eyes. Tempe dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She approached the corral, her heart pounding in her chest. The man noticed her, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but cautious. Tempe took a deep breath. "My name is Temperance West," she said. I was married to Thomas West." The man's expression didn't change, but Tempe saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief hesitation before he regained his composure. "Thomas West," he repeated, his voice flat. "I don't believe I know the name." Tempe hesitated. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, had imagined various scenarios, but now, faced with the reality of this man, of Thomas's son, she found herself at a loss for words.
He
was your father," Tempe finally said, her voice trembling slightly. The man's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in disbelief. "My father?"
he scoffed.
"My father died before I was born. That's what my mother always told me." "Your mother? She lied to you," Tempe said, her voice gentle. "She was protecting you, I think. But Thomas West was your father. I have proof." She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph she had found in Sarah's house, the picture of Thomas, Sarah, and the baby Samuel. She handed it to him, her hand trembling. Samuel took the photograph, his eyes fixed on the image. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly looked up at Tempe, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and a flicker of hope.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why are you telling me this now?" Tempe struggled to find the right words. "Because I believe you have a right to know," she said. "Because Thomas. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was my husband, and he was your father."
"And I
wanted to offer you some kind of closure." The river flowed. He had to decide who he was. Chapter 14. The Unforgiving Land. Samuel stared at the photograph, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He looked from the image of the young, smiling Thomas to Tempe, his eyes searching, questioning. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the gentle murmur of the river. "Closure?" he finally said, his voice laced with bitterness. "What good is closure? My father's dead. My mother's dead. The past is the past. It can't be changed." "No, it can't," Tempe agreed, her voice soft. "But it can be understood. It can be forgiven. And it can inform the future." Samuel scoffed. "Forgiven? You expect me to forgive a man who abandoned my mother, who left me to grow up without a father?" "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Tempe said. "I'm asking you to understand him. To see him as a flawed human being, capable of both great love and great mistakes." She paused, her gaze searching his. "And I'm asking you to understand me. I was his wife. I loved him. And I was blind to his faults." Samuel turned away, his shoulders slumping. He walked to the edge of the corral, staring out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. He was a man of the land, shaped by its harshness, its beauty, its relentless demands. He had learned to be self-reliant, to trust no one, to expect nothing. "My mother. She never talked about him," he said, his voice low. "She kept his memory locked away, like a secret she couldn't bear to share." "She was protecting you," Tempe said. "She loved you, and she wanted to shield you from the pain of his betrayal.
And what about you?
Samuel asked, turning back to face her. Did you love him, even after you found out
About me?
Tempe hesitated. It was a question she had been wrestling with for weeks, ever since she had discovered the letters. I did, she said finally, her voice firm. I loved him deeply. But my love was incomplete. I idealized him, I saw him as perfect, and that wasn't fair to him, or to myself. I'm still learning to understand the man he really was. Samuel studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. And what do you want from me? He asked. Why did you come here? Tempe took a deep breath. I came to offer you a connection, she said.
To your father, to your past.
I have no claims on you, Samuel. I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know the truth. And I wanted to offer you my friendship if you'll accept it. Samuel was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land, painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple. I don't know, he finally said, his voice hesitant. I need time to
process this. To think about it.
Of course, Tempe said. Take all the time you need. She turned to leave, but Samuel stopped her. Stay, he said. Stay for supper. We can talk more. Tempe hesitated, then nodded. She followed him to the ranch house, a simple, rustic building, but warm and inviting. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they talked, slowly, cautiously, about their lives, about Thomas, about Sarah. Samuel told Tempe about his childhood, about his struggles, about his dreams. He spoke of his love for the land, of his connection to the animals, of his longing for a family, a sense of belonging. Tempe listened patiently, her heart aching for this man, this son of Thomas, who had been deprived of a father's love, of a family's support. She saw in him a reflection of Thomas, but also a strength, a resilience, that was all his own. As the evening wore on, a tentative bond began to form between them, a fragile connection forged from shared loss, from a shared history. They were strangers, and yet they were connected by a bond that was stronger than blood, a bond of shared humanity. The land itself would determine the path. Chapter 15. A storm of truth and lies. Tempe stayed at the ranch for several days, spending time with Samuel, getting to know him, learning about his life, and slowly, tentatively, building a bridge across the chasm of their shared past. They worked together, tending to the animals, mending fences, sharing the simple routines of ranch life. They talked, sometimes for hours, about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the practicalities of ranching to the deeper questions of life, love, and loss. Tempe found herself drawn to Samuel's quiet strength, his resilience, his deep connection to the land. He was a man of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes, revealing a depth of emotion, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. She also saw in him the echoes of Thomas, the same stubborn streak, the same passionate nature, the same capacity for both great kindness and great cruelty. It was a complex inheritance, a legacy of both love and betrayal, and Tempe realized that Samuel was still grappling with its implications, still trying to define himself in the shadow of a father he had never known. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching a storm gather on the horizon, Samuel turned to Tempe, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, his voice low. About forgiving my father. About understanding him. Tempe nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension.
And?
She asked. I don't know if I can forgive him, Samuel said, his voice raw with emotion. He abandoned my mother.
He abandoned me.
That's a hard thing to forgive. I understand, Tempe said. But forgiveness isn't about condoning his actions. It's about releasing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. It's about finding peace. Samuel was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the approaching storm. The wind was picking up, whipping the trees, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I want to understand him, Samuel said finally. I want to know why he made the choices he did. I want to know what kind of man he really was. Tempe reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle, reassuring. We'll do it together, she said. We'll explore his past. We'll uncover the truth, whatever it may be. As if on cue, a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The storm had arrived, unleashing its fury on the land. And at that moment, a figure emerged from the darkness, riding towards the ranch house, his face obscured by the rain and the shadows. Tempe and Samuel stood up, their eyes fixed on the approaching rider. As he drew closer, Tempe's blood ran cold. It was Jack McGraw. He had escaped. He dismounted, his clothes soaked, his face a mask of cold fury. He held a gun in his hand, his eyes locked onto Tempe. I told you you'd pay for this, Tempe, he said, his voice low and menacing. You betrayed me, and now you're going to die. Samuel stepped in front of Tempe, shielding her with his body. Get out of here, McGraw, he said, his voice firm. This is my property. You're not welcome here. McGraw laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You think you can stop me, boy? You're nothing. Just like your father. The words hung in the air, a revelation, a truth that had been hidden for years. Samuel stared at McGraw, his eyes widening in disbelief. My father? He stammered. McGraw smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. That's right, boy. Thomas West was your father. And he abandoned you, just like he abandoned everyone who ever loved him. He raised the gun. The storm raged around them, a reflection of the turmoil within. Truth and lies collided, the past and the present merging in a violent confrontation. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Everything was coming apart at once. Chapter 16. The Gunslinger's Code. McGraw's revelation hung in the air, a cruel twist of fate delivered amidst the raging storm. Samuel staggered back, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, his world crumbling around him. Tempe, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to protect this man, this son of Thomas, from McGraw's venomous lies. Don't listen to him, Samuel, she said, her voice firm. He's lying. He's trying to manipulate you. McGraw laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that was swallowed by the wind. Am I Tempe? Or am I finally telling the truth? Your precious Thomas wasn't the saint you thought he was. He was a liar, a cheat, and a coward. Samuel turned to Tempe, his eyes filled with confusion and pain. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Was he really my father? Tempe hesitated. She had wanted to tell Samuel the truth in her own way, in her own time, but McGraw had stolen that opportunity from her, twisting the truth into a weapon of revenge. Yes, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He was your father. But McGraw is twisting the truth. Thomas. He made mistakes, but he wasn't the man McGraw is describing. McGraw raised his gun, aiming it at Tempe. Enough lies, he said, his voice cold and steady. It's time to end this. But before he could pull the trigger, Samuel stepped in front of Tempe, shielding her with his body. No, he said, his voice firm. You won't hurt her. McGraw sneered. You're protecting her? She betrayed you, just like your father betrayed your mother. She's the reason you grew up without a father. That's not true, Samuel said, his voice unwavering. My mother made her own choices. And Tempe. She's trying to help me. She's the only one who's told me the truth. He turned to Tempe, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. I don't know what happened between you and my father, he said. But I know you're not my enemy. And I won't let him hurt you. He turned back to McGraw, his body tensed, ready to fight. Get off my land, McGraw, he said, his voice low and menacing. And don't ever come back. McGraw hesitated, his eyes darting between Samuel and Tempe. He had expected them to cower, to beg for mercy, but he had underestimated their courage, their resilience. He had underestimated the bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of shared loss and newfound truth. You're making a mistake, boy, McGraw said, his voice losing some of its confidence. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who you are, Samuel said. You're a coward, a bully, and a murderer. And you're not going to hurt anyone else. He took a step towards McGraw, his fists clenched. McGraw, seeing the determination in Samuel's eyes, the raw strength in his stance, slowly lowered his gun. He knew he was outmatched, outnumbered, and he knew that he had lost. This isn't over, McGraw said, his voice filled with venom. I'll be back. And you'll both regret this. He turned and mounted his horse, disappearing into the storm, his threat echoing in the wind. Samuel and Tempe stood there for a moment, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding. The storm began to subside, the rain softening to a drizzle, the wind dying down. Samuel turned to Tempe, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse. For everything. Tempe reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle, reassuring. We did it together, she said. We faced the storm, and we survived. They had faced the storm, both literally and metaphorically. The truth, as brutal as it was, had been revealed, and they had stood together, united against a common enemy. The gunslinger's code, the twisted morality of Jack McGraw, had been challenged, and for the moment, at least, it had been defeated. But a reckoning was still to come. Chapter 17.
Between Law and Loyalty.
The aftermath of McGraw's escape and his confrontation with Tempe and Samuel left a heavy cloud of unease hanging over Redemption. Sheriff Brody, furious and embarrassed by McGraw's escape, doubled his efforts to recapture the outlaw, sending out patrols, posting wanted posters, and offering a substantial reward for his capture. Tempe, however, knew that McGraw wouldn't be easily caught. He was cunning, resourceful, and he had allies, men who were loyal to him, either out of fear or a shared disregard for the law. She also knew that McGraw's threat to return was not an idle one. He was a man driven by revenge, and he wouldn't rest until he had settled the score. She and Samuel returned to Redemption, Samuel reluctantly agreeing to stay at Tempe's house, recognizing the danger they both faced. The townspeople, initially shocked by Samuel's presence and the revelation of his parentage, gradually accepted him, offering him support and understanding. They had seen his courage, his willingness to stand up to McGraw, and they respected him for it. Brody, however, was conflicted. He was grateful to Samuel for protecting Tempe, but he was also wary of him, unsure of his loyalties. He knew that Samuel was Thomas West's son, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had inherited his father's flaws, his capacity for deception. I appreciate what you did for Tempe, Samuel, Brody said, his voice gruff but laced with caution. But I need to know where you stand. Are you with us or against us? Samuel met Brody's gaze, his expression unwavering. I'm with Tempe, he said, and I'm against McGraw. That's all you need to know. Brody studied him for a moment, his eyes searching, assessing. He saw in Samuel a strength, a determination that reminded him of Tempe. He also saw a vulnerability, a sadness that touched his heart. All right, Samuel, Brody said finally. I'll trust you, but don't give me reason to regret it. Samuel nodded. I won't. The days that followed were filled with a tense anticipation. Tempe and Samuel worked together, preparing for McGraw's inevitable return. They fortified Tempe's house, stocking it with supplies, and practicing their shooting skills. They also spent hours talking, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes. Tempe learned more about Samuel's life, about his struggles, his dreams. She saw in him a good man, a man who had been dealt a difficult hand in life, but who had managed to retain his integrity, his sense of honor. Samuel, in turn, learned more about Tempe, about her strength, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to justice. He saw in her a woman who had overcome adversity, who had faced her demons, and who had emerged stronger, wiser. They developed a deep respect for each other, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual admiration. It was a bond that transcended the complexities of their past, the tangled web of love and betrayal that had connected their families. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Samuel turned to Tempe, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about my father," he said, his voice low. "About Thomas." Tempe nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "What about him?" she asked. "I don't know if I can ever forgive him for abandoning my mother, for abandoning me," Samuel said. "But I'm starting to understand him. He was a flawed man, caught between two worlds, two loves. He made mistakes, but he wasn't all bad." Tempe reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle, reassuring. "He wasn't," she agreed. "He was a complex man, capable of both great love and great cruelty. And he left a legacy, Samuel. A legacy that includes you." Samuel smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Thank you, Tempe," he said, "for everything." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They were caught between law and loyalty, between the demands of justice and the pull of family, but they were united in their determination to face whatever the future held, together. They were on precarious ground, between a man who upheld the law and a man who had a blood connection. Chapter 18. The Redemption Road. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in redemption remained palpable, a constant, simmering undercurrent that permeated every aspect of daily life. Sheriff Brody's patrols continued their relentless search for McGraw, but the outlaw remained elusive, a ghost haunting the edges of the territory, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed. Tempe and Samuel, meanwhile, settled into an uneasy routine, their lives intertwined by circumstance and a shared determination to protect themselves and the town. They worked together, running the bank, managing the ranch, and preparing for McGraw's inevitable return. They also continued to explore their complex relationship, navigating the delicate balance between their newfound friendship and the lingering shadows of their shared past. Samuel, initially hesitant and reserved, gradually began to open up, sharing his thoughts, his feelings, his dreams. He spoke of his longing for a family, for a place to belong, for a sense of purpose. He also spoke of his growing respect for Tempe, his admiration for her strength, her resilience, her unwavering commitment to justice. Tempe, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn to Samuel's quiet strength, his integrity, his deep connection to the land. She saw in him a man who had overcome adversity, who had faced his demons, and who had emerged with his spirit intact. She also saw in him a reflection of Thomas, but a better version, a man who had learned from his father's mistakes, who was determined to forge his own path, to live a life of honor and purpose. One afternoon, while they were working at the bank, a young boy rushed in, his face pale and breathless. "Sheriff Brody needs help," he exclaimed. "McGraw's men. They're attacking the jail. They're trying to free him." Tempe and Samuel exchanged a look of alarm. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. McGraw had returned, and he was making his move. "Stay here," Tempe said to Jedediah, her voice firm. "Lock the doors, and don't let anyone in." She grabbed her derringer, and Samuel grabbed a rifle from behind the counter. They rushed out of the bank, heading towards the jail, the sounds of gunfire echoing in the distance. The scene that greeted them was chaotic. McGraw's men, a dozen or so rough-looking outlaws, were firing at the jail, their bullets peppering the walls. Brody and his deputies were returning fire, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down. Tempe and Samuel didn't hesitate. They joined the fight, taking cover behind a water trough, their weapons blazing. Tempe, despite her age, was a surprisingly good shot, her aim steady, her hand unwavering. Samuel, with his rancher's experience, was even better, his rifle shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. The tide of the battle began to turn. McGraw's men, surprised by the unexpected resistance, began to fall back, their attack faltering. But McGraw himself was nowhere to be seen. Tempe, her heart pounding in her chest, scanned the scene, searching for the outlaw. She knew he wouldn't give up easily, that he would be looking for an opportunity to strike. And then she saw him. He was on the roof of the jail, his gun aimed at Sheriff Brody, who was exposed and vulnerable. Tempe reacted instinctively. She raised her derringer, took aim, and fired. The bullet struck McGraw in the shoulder, spinning him around, his shot going wild. McGraw, clutching his wounded shoulder, glared at Tempe, his eyes filled with hatred. He raised his gun again, but before he could fire, Samuel shot him, the bullet hitting him squarely in the chest. McGraw crumpled to the ground, his body falling from the roof with a sickening thud. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, surrendered, their fight gone. The battle was over. Tempe and Samuel rushed to Brody's side, their hearts filled with relief. He was wounded but alive. As they tended to Brody's wounds, Tempe looked towards McGraw's lifeless body. The storm had passed, the threat was extinguished, but the cost had been high. The road to redemption was long and arduous, paved with sacrifice, loss, and the constant struggle between good and evil. But Tempe and Samuel had taken a significant step on that road. Together, their bond strengthened by the fires of adversity. The town was safe, but at a price. Chapter 19. Scars of Yesterday. The death of Jack McGraw marked a turning point for redemption. The town, freed from the grip of his terror, began to breathe again, to heal, to rebuild. Sheriff Brody, recovering from his wounds, was hailed as a hero, his courage and determination celebrated by the grateful townspeople. Tempe, too, was lauded for her bravery, her unwavering commitment to justice, but she found little solace in the praise. The scars of the past, both her own and those inflicted by McGraw, remained, a constant reminder of the price of their hard-won victory. Samuel, now publicly acknowledged as Thomas West's son, faced a different kind of challenge. He was no longer an outsider, a stranger, but he was also burdened by the legacy of his father, a legacy of both love and betrayal. He struggled to reconcile his newfound identity with the man he had always believed himself to be, to find his place in a community that had once been defined by his father's absence. Tempe and Samuel, their bond forged in the crucible of conflict, continued to support each other, navigating the complexities of their intertwined lives. They worked together, running the bank, managing their respective properties, and slowly, tentatively, exploring the possibilities of their future. One day, as they were walking through the town cemetery, visiting Thomas's grave, Samuel turned to Tempe, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about my father," he said, his voice low, "about the choices he made." Tempe nodded, her heart filled with a familiar mixture of sadness and understanding. "What about him?" she asked. "I still don't understand why he did what he did," Samuel said. "Why he abandoned my mother, why he kept me a secret. But I'm starting to realize that he wasn't all bad. He had his flaws, his weaknesses, but he also had his good qualities. He was a complex man. Tempe agreed. And he loved you, Samuel. In his own way, he loved you." Samuel was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on his father's headstone. "I wish I could have known him," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I wish I could have had a chance to talk to him, to ask him the questions that have haunted me my whole life." Tempe reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know," she said. "But you have his legacy, Samuel. You have his blood, his spirit. And you have the opportunity to make your own choices, to live your own life, to be the man you want to be." Samuel smiled, a tentative smile that held a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Tempe," he said, "for everything." They stood there for a moment, in silence, their bond strengthened by their shared grief, their shared understanding, their shared hope for the future. As they walked away from the grave, Tempe realized that the scars of yesterday, while they would always remain, were no longer defining them. They were healing, growing, evolving, and they were doing it together. The wounds of the past were still present, but they were no longer festering, no longer preventing them from moving forward. They had found a measure of peace, a sense of closure, and they had discovered a new kind of family, a bond forged not by blood, but by choice, by shared experience, by mutual respect and affection. Redemption, too, was healing, its scars slowly fading, its spirit renewed. The town was becoming a symbol of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a place where the past could be acknowledged, forgiven, and ultimately transcended. The townspeople, grateful and supportive, had witnessed their quiet growth, their shared grief, their growing courage, and their love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The months that followed McGraw's death were a time of healing and growth, both for Tempe and Samuel, and for the town of Redemption. The bank flourished, the ranch prospered, and the community thrived, its spirit renewed by the triumph of good over evil. Tempe and Samuel, their bond deepened by shared experience and mutual respect, found themselves increasingly drawn to each other, their friendship evolving into something more profound, more meaningful. They spent their days working side by side, managing their respective businesses, supporting the community, and navigating the complexities of their intertwined lives. They shared meals, stories, laughter, and the quiet comfort of each other's presence. They found solace in their shared grief, their shared understanding, and their shared hope for the future. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of Tempe's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple, Samuel turned to Tempe, his expression serious. "Tempe," he said, his voice low and hesitant. I need to tell you something." Tempe's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed a shift in their relationship, a growing intimacy that went beyond friendship, but she had been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid to risk the bond they had so carefully built. "What is it, Samuel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath. I've fallen in love with you, Tempe, he said, his eyes searching hers. "I know it's complicated, I know we have a past, but I can't deny my feelings any longer." Tempe's heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of joy, fear, and a profound sense of wonder. She had allowed herself to dream of this moment, but she had never truly believed it was possible. "Oh, Samuel," she said, her voice trembling. I love you too." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "I know it's a lot to ask," he said, "given everything that's happened, given who my father was." "Your father is not you, Samuel," Tempe said, her voice firm. "You are your own man. And you are a good man, a kind man, a man I am proud to love." He smiled, a radiant smile that lit up his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future together. The final confrontation was not one of guns and violence, but of hearts and horizons. They had faced their demons, confronted their past, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than they could have ever imagined. They married in a simple ceremony in the town square, surrounded by the people of Redemption, the community that had witnessed their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. Sheriff Brody, fully recovered from his wounds, gave Tempe away, his eyes filled with pride and affection. Jedediah, his nervous demeanor replaced by a confident smile, served as Samuel's best man. As Tempe and Samuel exchanged their vows, they looked out at the vast, open horizon, at the endless possibilities that stretched before them. They had found their redemption, their peace, their love, in the heart of the unforgiving land, and they were ready to face the future, together, their hearts united, their spirits strong. Their love was no longer a forbidden dream, but a vibrant reality, a testament to the enduring power of hope, forgiveness, and the transformative magic of second chances. They could not have done this on their own. Epilogue. Years passed, and Redemption flourished under the stewardship of Tempe and Samuel. The bank became a cornerstone of the territory, a symbol of stability and prosperity. The ranch expanded, its herds growing, its fields yielding bountiful harvests. And Tempe and Samuel's love deepened, weathering the storms of life with unwavering grace and resilience. They built a family, welcoming children and grandchildren into their lives, filling their home with laughter, love, and the joyful chaos of a growing clan. Samuel, finally finding his place in the world, embraced his role as husband, father and community leader, his past no longer a burden, but a source of strength and wisdom. Tempe, her silver hair now a crown of wisdom and experience, continued to manage the bank, her sharp mind and unwavering integrity guiding its success. She also became a mentor to young women, encouraging them to pursue their dreams, to break barriers, to challenge the limitations imposed upon them by society. They often sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunsets paint the sky in a kaleidoscope of colors, reminiscing about their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. They remembered Thomas, with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness, acknowledging his flaws, but also celebrating the legacy he had left behind, a legacy that had ultimately brought them together. They remembered Jack McGraw, too, with a sense of gratitude for the lessons they had learned from his darkness, from the danger he had posed, from the strength they had found in facing him. He had been a catalyst for their transformation, a force that had pushed them to confront their demons, to embrace their true selves, to find their love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with peace and contentment, Tempe looked out at the vast, starlit sky. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" she said, her voice soft, reflective. Samuel nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "It has," he agreed. "And I wouldn't trade it for anything." They had traveled a long and winding road, a road paved with hardship, loss, and the constant struggle between good and evil. But they had reached their destination, a place of love, belonging, and redemption, a place where the scars of yesterday had faded, replaced by the radiant glow of a future filled with hope, promise, and the enduring power of their love. Their love was no longer a dream, but a reality, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformative power of forgiveness, and the enduring magic of second chances. They were complete.